Ancient India and Greece show some peculiar similarities that suggest some type of early exchange of ideas. For instance, they both had an early atomic theory. They both accepted the same 4 elements, plus a heavenly substance, which the Greeks called ether and the Indians akasa. And they both had believers in reincarnation. In Greece, this was true of Pythagoras and Plato. And curiously, these beliefs were not shared by the Mesopotamian cultures in between Greece and India, including the Persians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and so on. In this lecture, we'll study the evidence of early contact between India and Greece, both direct and through Mesopotamian intermediaries. We'll start with the Indus Valley civilization of India, which traded with Mesopotamia. We even read of Indian boats docked in a Mesopotamian harbor. And archaeologists have found a ship with Greek sailors from the Mycenaean period, the so-called Uluburun shipwreck, which contained products from Mesopotamia and even Afghanistan, close to India. Then, during the Persian period, the eastern part of Greece and the northwestern part of India were both conquered by the Persian Empire, making India and Greece part of the same empire. And in this era, both Greek and Indian merchants frequented the Persian capital Persepolis, and Greek sculptors were known to make works for the kings of Persia. One heroic Greek navigator named Skylax was even asked by the Persian king Darius to sail down the Indus River to explore this territory for later conquest. Remarkably, Skylax even wrote a book about his voyage, which is unfortunately lost. But luckily, Greek writers did quote from it. Greek physicians also worked at the Persian court, among them Ctesias, who lived there for 17 years. And he also wrote a book about India, based on his interactions with Indian travelers in Persia. And we even read that the Persians deported a community of rebelling Greeks to Bactria, next to India. And Alexander the Great supposedly later found this community 2 centuries later, still speaking Greek. And finally, there's even a Greek report of an Indian sage reaching Athens, who outsmarted none other than Socrates. So we have a lot to get to. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. You'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface-level understanding you get on other channels. So go check it out for yourself. Let's start. Interaction between India and Mesopotamia goes way back. By the late 3rd millennium BC, we find typical Mesopotamian cylinder seals in the Indian city Mohenjo-Daro. And around the same time, we also found carnelian beads from the Indus Valley in Sumer, Mesopotamia. So clearly there must have been trade going back and forth. The Sumerians also speak of Meluha, which is believed to refer to the Indus Valley civilization, based on the goods they sell. And we also read of, quote, Su Ilisu, interpreter of the Maluan language. And there was even a Meluha settlement in Mesopotamia with, quote, large boats. And there is an inscription where the king Naram Sin lists a number of rebels that opposed his rule, and among them was, quote, a man from Meluha. But not long after, in 1900 BC, the Indus Valley civilization collapsed. On the other side of the Middle East, the Mycenaean Greeks, starting around 1500 BC, also traded with Mesopotamia. Notable here is the Uluburun ship, which sank on the coast of Turkey around 1300 BC. It is the wealthiest and most complete Bronze Age ship ever found, containing goods from 7 different civilizations. There were logs from Nubia, blue glass from Mesopotamia, storage jars, and a bronze statue of a god from Canaan, the land of the Old Testament, scarabs from Egypt, including a gold scarab bearing the name Nefertiti, the great queen of Egypt. swords and daggers from Italy and Greece, tin and lapis lazuli probably from Afghanistan, and even a stone mace from the Balkans. And judging from personal possessions of the sailors, at least 2 Mycenaeans were on board, of what seems to have been a Canaanite ship, so a very international affair. But around 1200 BC, the Mycenaean civilization also collapsed. Trade resumed in the 7th century BC with the Assyrians, and more intensely in the 6th century BC with the Persian Empire. Greek merchants, craftsmen, mercenary soldiers, and even tourists were known to visit the Persian Empire. In the 6th century BC, India and Greece had also become directly connected within the Persian Empire. In 546 BC, the Persian king Cyrus conquered Ionia, now the Turkish coast, where most of the early Greek philosophers lived. And in 518 BC, Darius I conquered Gandhara, which is in modern-day Pakistan, which was previously part of India. In this period, contact of India and Greece with the Persians in the middle intensified. Persian kings imported Greek doctors, engineers, and artists. For instance, Greek sculptors were at work in Persepolis, as statues showed typical Greek-style drapery. And we even know the name of one of these sculptors, namely Telephonus. According to Pliny the Elder, he was, quote, on a par with the greatest of Greek sculptors, but was little known in Greece because he spent his time in the workshops of the Persian kings, Xerxes and Darius. We also know the names of several Greek physicians who resided at the Persian court. Democedes spent 2 years as the personal physician of Darius I, and Apollonides became the physician to Artaxerxes I. But, we read, he then seduced the king's sister. Not a good idea, for which he was buried alive. And then there was the physician Ctesias, who we will meet again, who worked for 17 years at the Persian court. We even read that the Persians deported the Branchidi family, which was a family of priests, and they were deported to Bactria after the Ionian revolt against Persian rule in 499 BC. This family had chosen to side with the Persians and was therefore moved for protection. Alexander the Great, we later read in his biographies, found their city and then killed them all to avenge this betrayal against the Greeks. Unlike the Greeks, the Indians unfortunately left no records about their dealings in Persia. In fact, they didn't record histories at all until much later. But we do have in the Persian records some evidence of their presence. For instance, inscriptions of Darius mention Bactrian and Indian women from Gandhara who were sold in Persia as slaves. And we also read of Indian mercenaries and even an Indian colony located near Nippur in the 5th century BC. Some Indian names also appear in the Persian texts. In 499 BC, for instance, the Indian Abatema is said to have traveled from India to Susa, accompanied by 20 men. And in the year 498 BC, Karaba was sent by their king to India, accompanied by 180 men. And we read of an Indian woman named Busasa, who maintained an inn in the city of Kish. Quite a cute detail. And then at Persepolis, on the famous Apadana reliefs, the peoples of 23 nations are depicted, and they include the Greeks, specifically the Ionians, the Bactrians on the border of India in northern Afghanistan, and also the Indians from Gandhara. Contact between Greece and India became even more direct in the year 517 BC, when a Greek named Skylax was commissioned by Darius himself to sail down the Indus River. His goal was to explore the possibility of sea trade between India and Persia. The historian Herodotus writes about him, Darius, desiring to know where this Indos issued into the sea, sent ships manned by Skylax, a man of Karyanda, sailed down the river towards the east and the sunrise till they came to the sea. After the circumnavigation, Darius subdued the Indians and made use of this sea. Skylax even wrote a book about his journey, the first Greek book about India. Unfortunately, this book is now lost, yet a few fragments remain in later Greek works. But, fortunately again, these fragments don't tell us very much. He wrote, for instance, that the northern Indians had lighter skin than the southern Indians, whom he strangely calls Ethiopians. And he claimed cannibalism was practiced by some Indian communities. And most significantly, he wrote of people who live outdoors and who only eat wild grains. And these must have been the Indian ascetics or yogis. But this is about all the factual information we get. Skylax also tells us of a number of bizarre fantastical creatures. He tells us of the monophthalmoi, who had only one eye, and the enotikoitoi, who crept inside their own ears to sleep, and the skiapodes, who had enormous feet which provided shade when they slept. Very strange. And by the way, if you're wondering, it is quite common for ancient authors to confuse real-life reports with the most crazy fantastical stories. We see that all the time in almost all early civilizations. And by the way, it doesn't even need to mean that Skylax was simply lying here, making all these stories up, for he might have heard about these stories from the people that he visited. And in fact, about the same creatures also appear in a Zoroastrian text. The historian Herodotus, by the way, also lists some fantastical stories about India. He tells us of giant ants that dig up gold dust and that are guarded by griffins. And this account became especially popular as we see it repeated by many later Greek writers. And Herodotus also speaks of headless Indias whose eyes were in their chests. The second Greek book on India was written by Ctesias in the 5th century BC. Whom we've already met as a Greek physician at the Persian court. Ctesias didn't travel to India, but got his information from Bactrian and Indian merchants and diplomats. And based on the information that he gathered, he wrote the books Persica and Indica, about Persia and India. And like the books of Skylax, these books are both lost, although quotations are found in the works of later writers. Ctesias does give us some more information. He writes about the Indian rivers, about the Indian elephant, which he describes in some detail, about monkeys, parrots, serpents, a bird which is poisonous to eat, various fruits, the Indian weather, pygmies, about the supposed long lifespan of Indians. He called the Indians, quote, the most just of people. And he also added some fantastical creatures, of course, including the dog-headed people. Notoriously, Ctesias also mentioned the manticore, a quote, beast which has a human face, is the size of a lion and is red like cinnabar. He has 3 rows of teeth, human ears, and light blue eyes like a man's. It has a tail like the land scorpion, on which there is a sting more than a cubit long, and it can fire its stings as far as a plethron. And the word manticora or manticore means man-eater. And some scholars believe, based on the flimsiest evidence, that this might be a confused description of a tiger, given the size and the red color of the animal. But I'm not so sure about that. Unfortunately, Ctesias also skips a number of really important topics. Or alternatively, these descriptions were lost in time. For instance, we hear nothing about Indian religion, mythology, and science, which would have been really useful to remove uncertainties that we often have in the dates of Indian history. Many Indian texts still have uncertainties of centuries, but unfortunately he tells us nothing about these topics. As we have read, this account also contained those fantastical elements, and this caused even some ancient authors to doubt this source. But again, Ctesias might not have been a liar, which he was at the time accused of. For perhaps he was just genuinely writing down what he heard. For instance, he tells us of a magnetic tree that draws gold to it, which might be a distorted reference to the superstition that the branches of a tree were used to locate gold, as happened in quite a lot of societies actually. The first account of a Greek writer of an Indian arriving in Greece dates to the 4th century BC. And as usual, unfortunately, the Indians made no mention of this figure. We read it in the work of Aristoxenus, a contemporary of Alexander, who tells us that an Indian yogi came to Athens and there he talked with Socrates. And we read, and Aristoxenus, the musician, said that this argument comes from the Indians. For a man of that people met Socrates in Athens and asked him what his philosophy was about. And when he said that he was investigating human life, the Indian laughed at him, saying that no one could understand human affairs if he ignored the divine. However, this account is from just after Alexander the Great brought back stories of Indian sages after he had invaded India, which caused somewhat of a hype among scholars. And since there is no corroborating evidence, the story is generally assumed to be a fabrication. In fact, the quote ends with, quote, "Whether this is true, no one can say for sure." So even the only piece of evidence for this story doubts whether it was true. And thus unfolded the early contact between India and Greece. In the next lecture, we'll discuss the belief in reincarnation among the early Greeks. We'll read that legendary philosophers such as Pythagoras and Empedocles openly claimed that they could remember their past lives. And not just as humans, but even as animals and plants. Later Greeks claimed that Pythagoras learned these ideas directly from the Indians. And in the next lecture, we'll study the evidence. But for now, if you want to know more about Greek or Indian history or any other topic from world history, then read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. Thank you so much for watching. Bye bye.